Welcome to Impact Farming, where we introduce you to the people and ideas that will have a massive impact on your farming operation. Brought to you by Farm Marketer. Sit down, start the engine, and let's roll with today's show.
Farmers Business Network has helped thousands of farming entrepreneurs reduce their cost of production and maximize the value of their crops. Now FBN membership is free. Sign up for free today and pursue your prosperity with Farmers Business Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Impact Farming Show. Today, I am so excited to have Terry Betker back on the show. Welcome back, Terry.
Hi, Tracy. Thanks for inviting me back. I love doing these sessions.
Love it, and we're so happy to have you. You are such a fountain of wisdom. We're so happy you can join us. Today, we are going to be talking about probably a bit of a heated topic, sensitive topic, debt, farm debt. And I'm calling this one Till Debt Do Us Part. So are you ready, Terry?
Yes, I am. I love the title.
Excellent. Before we dive in, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about you, your background, and Backswath management?
Sure. We're farm business management consultants at Backswath, and we help farmers with financial management discussions and all aspects of planning, succession or transition planning, strategy, business planning. In the business, we have peer groups that farmers participate in. We do bookkeeping. There's a whole broad aspect of how we help farmers pretty much in areas other than the operations or the marketing. And yeah, we've been doing this for quite a long time. Love the interaction with farmers.
Okay, love it. Thank you for sharing. So why don't we just really grab the bull by the horns here and talk about debt? Everybody, I think it's human nature to be scared of debt. It's risky. Business is risky. Debt makes us uncomfortable. Is debt a bad thing, Terry?
Well, Tracy, no, debt unto itself is not a bad thing. Now, people that may be listening to this in some situations are going to say to me and not agree with me, because there is, I think, in Western Canada, some pretty severe situations, just given as a result of the crops in the last couple of years and margins of profit and the amount of debt. So there's some pretty severe stress in some situations. So, there may be families out there who are feeling right now that debt is bad, but generally, and I've tried to understand this from discussions I have with farms. My answer to you, in this economic environment, debt is not a bad thing.
Okay. Debt is really a tool, isn't it?
Debt is exactly, Tracy. Debt is a tool that's no different than fertilizer. It's just the return on the debt is there's a cost to the debt and there's a cost to the fertilizer. And the cost to the fertilizer is that you get a return when you put it in the ground and get crops out of it. The cost of your debt, obviously, is the interest rate. Well, and that's why, in my opinion, debt in this environment is not necessarily a bad thing, because interest rates are really low. Just be like having really low fertilizer. It would be like buying nitrogen at 3 or 4 years ago when it was hugely expensive and when interest rates were hugely expensive. Well, even then it's not bad. It's just not very. It's not as easily managed. But you're right. That's just a tool, just a resource that farmers use, and they should be able to get a multiple of that, right? So if you pay interest, you should be able to generate a return on using that debt greater than the cost of interest, just like the fertilizer. If you can't get a return on fertilizer greater than the cost of fertilizer, you shouldn't be using it.
Ooh, that is gold. Nice, Terry. I like that analogy. Okay, that is fair enough. And really, if you think about it, Yes, when times are good, debt's a little less scary. When times are tough, debt scares us a little bit more. But if you want to be in business, and I know there's people out there probably that are debt-free, whatever the case is, but by and large, if you're going to try and do something on your own, be self-employed as a farmer or a business owner, chances are you're taking on some debt, right? For the most part.
Yeah. Yes.
You can't.
Yeah. Well, again, let's just use a combine. It's just the analogy of fertilizer. We'll use a combine. So you have two choices. You either borrow money to buy the combine, or you use all your money. And I mean, I could argue that from a management perspective, or from the technical discussion around this, you don't want to borrow 100% perhaps of the value of that combine, but you could argue that using 100% of your cash to buy a combine maybe isn't the best business decision either. So where would you, what are your options to where to spend that money, that cash? So using debt at anywhere from 2 to 4% can be a pretty attractive option right now.
Okay. Perfect. I guess I was kind of leading us down the rabbit trail there a little bit. We'll talk about that some more later. So we chat about, is debt bad? Now I'm going to ask you, because there's probably some people going, yeah, there is some bad debt. Is there such thing as bad debt?
Yeah. Yes, I think there is. So it would depend on how we define bad. So unproductive debt, undesirable debt. And then to understand the way because I spend time thinking about this and talking to farmers about this, because to me, where the debt has come from and what the purpose of the debt is, what the purpose of the debt is, would go a long way, at least to me, to defining whether it's good or bad debt. Okay. So if you've gone out of the farm and borrowed a bunch of money and basically leveraged farm assets to build a new house or buy a cottage or something that doesn't immediately have a productive component to it, I'm not sure that's bad debt, but that would be an unproductive debt. I
like that word better, unproductive.
Unproductive.
Bad can be discussed.
Yeah, we could, in the connotation of what bad means. Poorly structured debt in a balance sheet or on a farm could be construed as bad debt. Okay. Well, if you got too much debt due in the next 12 months, and where you can't meet those obligations, that would fall into that general category of bad debt or undesirable debt. If the debt on the balance sheet is building over time and it's a function of chronic business losses, that would be bad debt. That's debt that farmers don't want to have. And how or what do we do about that becomes a discussion that's pretty specific to each farm, Tracy, and not what we're talking about here today.
Okay. I'm good at leading people down the rabbit trail and then having to grab them and bring them back. So, okay, I'll get one more question right off the hop off my mind. Now, you hear of a lot of people, again, debt can be scary. So you watch TV shows, get out of debt, pay off all your debt, and I know you've mentioned it before on previous episodes that we've done, of farmers that just want to pay off all their debt. Now, is that the right idea? What do you have to say about that?
I would never tell a farmer who says to me that their goal is to get out of debt. I would never say to them that that's not a good goal. I would ask them why. So why do they want to be out of debt? And then my answer, you're going to ask me a lot of questions today, and I could probably answer everyone. Well, it depends, and it depends on the situation. So where is the family in its business life cycle? Like, what's going on in the farm? are they in the middle of an expansion? Are they in a period of where there's been 2 or 3 bad crops? So what's going on in their business? I call that the business life cycle. And then the other one is where they at in their personal life cycle. So perhaps that question may be different for somebody who's 60 plus years old versus somebody who's 30 plus years old, who wants to be out of debt. So
yes,
I have some better formed opinions in some of this discussion than others, Tracy. And I think that the right question here, the right way to answer your question is to ask that question back to the farmers, which I try to do. Why do you want to be out of debt? And if it's because, and sometimes it's just simply that they're at a point in their life where they don't want to owe any more money.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 100%. Makes perfect sense. But if the reason that they don't want to have debt is because the debt may be not structured correctly, maybe I can remember absolutely one discussion I had with a farm family, actually a number of years ago now, but they told me that the debt's killing them. Well, it wasn't the amount of debt. It was how quick they were trying to repay the debt. They were trying to repay their debt faster than the farm's earning capability was. Oh. So all we did was take a look at the structure. Remember I said the structure of the debt, and align the structure of the debt with what their earning ability was, and then, well, they were away to town. So then the goal of be out of debt, because I hate debt because it's having all this impact on our business and our relationships. And when we kind of got it dealt with, it kind of freed them up a little bit, and they came to have a different appreciation for what debt was doing in their business. They switched to Tracy from where it was having a negative influence on the business to where it became what you said, that resource that they were effectively using in their business.
Okay. I like that. And you are so right. You know better than I do. You work with farmers every day in many different operations, that the question about debt is specific to each farm operation. So that's a good warm up. I wanted to get some of your thoughts on, is debt good? How much? All of that good stuff. But now let's chat a little bit to give some meat and potatoes to the farmers about how much debt is too much debt. Again, we said, is debt good or bad? We've walked through that. But let's, get some meat and potatoes behind that. How much debt is too much? And I know there's guidelines and ratios. Can you share?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. Too much, a broad generalization of too much debt is debt what I talked about a minute ago, where the farm cannot generate. So the cash to pay debt comes from profit. And if the farm can't generate in a margin of profit sufficient to meet its debt obligations, then it's got too much debt. And then there's tools, there's things that could be done to try to remedy that situation. But you could probably generalize it as easy as that. And I will talk about some of the key metrics, because one of the things, so it's going to segue a little bit to your last question and this one as well. So we typically have multiple people in these farm operations, husband and wife, children, in-laws, brothers, cousins, and some of the farms are quite complex in their structure. They're all farming together. They all have an investment in the business, like there's their emotional investment in it, and there's the capital investment in it. And the capital investment, often to your point, has been financed. So each of those people will typically have a different comfort with risk. With risk associated with debt. And so how do we manage all those opinions, and where people might not worry about debt in a family while somebody else might find that really difficult to deal with. So to me, a lot of what we're talking about here when it comes to discussion around debt and how we then, so the point I'm going to try to make here is that we'd want in debt to separate the business discussion from the emotional discussion. And I don't want to discount the emotion that if somebody doesn't like debt and they find that to be risky and they don't like it, that's who they are. That's 100% fine. But when we're looking at the business, and it's easier for me because I'm not part of the family, right? So I would look at this, and I'm going to try to bring this discussion back to the business. So if we're only talking about our feelings around debt, then that's all we talk about. But if we can get the discussion down to the business aspect of it, it puts some context to the feelings. And that's the ratios. The ratios are the way that we distill debt down to a business discussion. And we use ratios all the time. And Tracy, no ratio ever makes a decision.
No.
The people make the decision. It's the ratios are putting context to those decisions. So the feelings that are used as a foundation to the decisions that get made are based on the information that's in front of them in these ratios. Okay.
I like that.
Yeah. So the ratios will matter or change from sector to sector. Oh, some of the ratios are different for a grain farm, potato farm, vegetable farm, dairy, feedlot. They all have somewhat different metrics. Some of them there are some ratios that are kind of common. So I just want to get that out there that there are some differences from sector to sector. And the other thing, as I've said before, the ratios that we use the same ratios, but we understand the ratios differently for our farmer who may be 30 years old compared to somebody who might be 60 years old. So I want to just talk about that in general here. And then I've got 4 or 5 ratios. And, Tracy, I don't know, I can't remember when we've had these discussions before, but if anybody ever was listening and they wanted, do we have a prioritized list of ratios? I mean, there's I don't know how many different ratios that you could use to put some perspective around this, but there's a few that are just really common, really important. I'd be happy to share those with you, Tracy, or your audience. I don't know how we could do that, but I'm happy to do that.
If people had questions, they could get in touch with you. I know you've expressed that you're okay with that.
100%, but I'll even share the ratios. Here they are. I mean, I'll send them to you, and then you can distribute them however. I don't care. Okay, so what are those ratios? Well, the first one that is it okay if I get into the detail of this now?
Yeah, please do. I was hoping you would.
Okay, so the first one that I wrote down, and I'm going to kind of go at these in order of importance from my perspective. The first one is called the debt servicing ratio, and I suspect pretty well everybody who's listening to this interview or this discussion will have come across debt servicing. So debt servicing, or the debt servicing ratio, is a ratio that simply measures the farm's earned, that's the key word here, the profit, the earned ability to make its annual principal and interest payments.
Okay.
And so this is the formula. You take the earned ability and you divide it by the principal and interest. Now, farming, as you said, is risky, and part of that risk is in the variability of what can happen on a farm from a production perspective and in the marketplace for a lot of farms from year to year. So ideally, if you had $1 of earnings for every $1 that you are obligated to pay on principal and interest for the next year, you'd be good to go.
Yeah.
So that would be, logic, right? I need to have $1. I've got $1. But what we want to get to, though, is some room for error. So if there's $1 of principal and interest payments, ideally, if a farm could have $1.50 of earnings, then they've got 50% or 50 cents of buffer. So the ratio is, a really good ratio to work with is 1.5 to 1. $1.50 of profit for every $1 of principal and interest. Okay. So any number greater than 1.5 simply gives you more room for error over time and more comfort, less risky. As you move lower to 1.3 and 1.2 and down to 1 to 1, then it becomes increasingly risky. Context for that is most lenders will lend into a situation where they think that the farm has $1.20 available for every $1 of principal and interest.
Okay.
They will lend below that, but then they need to factor in other things. So that's just a bit of a marker there. And people ask me, well, how low is too low? Well, I'm not about to say anything here. I'm not going to say this, Tracy. I can't put any certainty to this. It depends. Sorry, but it does depend. But a guideline: just be careful if if a farmer's debt servicing is falling below 1.2 to 1. That starts to be, hey, we need to pay attention to what's going on. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one has got to do with cash flow. So, and it is a measure of the farm's liquidity. So the measure of the farm's ability to generate cash or to have cash available to make the payments. So the second metric that I would work off of would be the working capital percentage. So you're just, that ratio is telling a farmer how much money they have to finance the operations for the next 12 months, which includes principal and interest. Okay. So they have the profit, but then here's the key. Can they turn the profit into cash flow to meet those obligations? The working capital percentage is the bridge to that, if you will. It's kind of simplifying this discussion. But I want to know, first, do I have the earnings available to meet my obligation? And second, do I have the cash flow to do it? So the next ratio that I would look at looks at debt as it compares to the amount of investment that the farm family has in their business. So the relationship between debt in the business and equity in the business. So in situations where there's a $1 of debt for every $1 of equity, that's okay. There's lots of farms like that. Where there starts to be more debt than equity, lenders then look at that and say, well, we theoretically have more investment in this business than the family does, and they connotate that with increased risk on their part. Okay. So ideally, when I'm looking at these discussions with farm families, and so a family can, the debt servicing ratio that I talked about, Tracy, and the working capital ratio I talked about, they change every year because the production cycle of every year changes. The relationship between debt and equity is slower to change because we're talking about big numbers, all the equity in a business of $1 million or several $1 million and debt in the business of $1 million or $7 million. Changing relationships between debt and equity is a function of profit. And it just takes time, longer for that to occur. But why I look at that ratio is it puts longer term parameters around the risk of borrowing money. So if in a farm, if the farm had $500,000 of debt and $500,000 of equity, there'd be a one-to-one relationship.
Okay.
And if the farm went out and borrowed a bunch of money, like say another $500,000, they'd now have $1 million of debt and $500,000 of equity. They have $2 of debt for every dollar of equity, and so that's riskier for them. And where that risk gets measured, then, Tracy, is back in what are the principal and interest payments associated with that $1 million, and can the farm generate enough profit to make them? Okay. So I want to look at the long-term risk of taking on more debt. Short-term risk, debt servicing and cash flow. Long-term risk, debt to equity.
Okay.
Well, there's three. I got one more.
Okay.
And the other one, the other one then has nothing to do with actually the debt or the cash flow. It's got to do with the operation. And I want to know how financially efficient the farm is. What is its operating efficiency ratio? In other words, if a farm starts off at with $1 million in sales, and it pays all of its expenses except for interest and depreciation, then there should be, again, should is a strong word. The general industry standards are you would ideally like to have $250,000 or $350,000 of margin there. That's the operating efficiency margin. You take that margin and divide it by the million and get a ratio. So the higher that ratio is, the more financially efficient that farm is, the more efficient it is at taking all its inputs, Tracy, and generating a margin of profit. And that margin of profit is what they use to make principal and interest payments.
Okay.
So I want to look at the debt servicing and the cash flow. I want to look at the long-term risk in relationship between debt and equity. And then I want to look at the farm's earning ability. How financially efficient is that farm? And so the last thing that I would do when I'm looking at guidelines and ratios and talking to farms is to examine everything, especially the four I just talked about, over a trend line. So what's happening over the last 5 years? Is our situation strengthening? Is our situation weakening? I mean, it would always be variable. So we need then to understand that historical performance and the trend lines, and then use that information. That's the business discussion when we're deciding to borrow more money next year and do whatever we're going to do. You know, what's the history telling us? What has the farm's capabilities been? And if they've been strong, of course, then there's less risk of taking on more debt. If they've been weaker, then there's more risk. A farm with a strong balance sheet, not much debt, can easily take on more debt. A farm that's got more debt in it, could be for any number of reasons, then they need, well, quite frankly, some of them need to be a little bit more careful.
Okay, I want to ask you a question. That's great stuff. So sometimes I think farmers, we know, may or may not love the numbers end of the business. We hear it all the time. Farmers become farmers to produce crops or animals, right?
Yeah.
So the numbers already, and I'll maybe throw myself under the bus. I'm good with my financials, my cash flow, my net worth. Ratios might sound a little bit intimidating. Now, I want to wrap this up and say, if a farmer out there, some action steps, and see if you agree with me on this. if I am a farmer and I have my books done and I get financials, my balance sheet, my income statement, I have all that. And a lot of farmers do. I know you've said that, but a lot of them don't look at it much further than that. So I have the information being put in. I could probably start to just do a quick Google or get in touch with Terry and get those ratios. And I can take a stab at them myself because they're pretty straightforward, right? Now, my third one, where maybe somebody might get a little bit stuck, so to speak, would be going, okay, is this good or bad? What the heck does this mean? And where do we go from here? And I know we're going to talk about it later, but this is where I'm giving a pitch to farmers bringing on professionals onto their team. You have your accountant, and they can likely help you out. A farm management consultant can help you walk through this stuff, right? Because so often, my long-winded spiel here, Terry, I'm wrapping it up to a point here. As farmers, we do everything ourselves, business owners. So sometimes we think we need to know everything and do everything. So we look at these ratios, we go, oh my gosh, this is intimidating. We put it away and we don't do it. At some point, we need to seek minds that can help us, right? And that's fairly easy for somebody like you to look at our financials and go, okay, let's figure out your ratios. And here's maybe what you need to do at this point.
I agree there. I agree with everything you said. There's one thing I might put on the front of that even. Sometimes it seems to me that farmers are sensitive to, well, is my situation bad? And am I going to look goofy and ask you this question? And you know, Tracy, I've said this before, and I've done this for a long time. I have yet, and this is 100% a serious comment. I have yet to find a farm with a perfect set of financial statements. Okay. There is always room for improvement. I would encourage everybody out there. First off, I don't think all farms need to learn how to calculate all the ratios. I mean, we're all good at different things. You talked about things that you're good at and things that you're not as good at. Heck, I've got lots of things that I'm not good at. We could have a whole other episode about that where we could just tell everybody, well, I'm not good at this. What about your turn, Tracy? What are you not good at? But when it comes to finance, yeah, if the people on the farm love numbers, a lot of them would be accountants, not farmers. Absolutely. But I think the information is important to have. And the part that you're saying is that we need to understand that information so we can apply it to the decision-making processes. And I'll get farmers. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a farmer, and he says, all year I just made decisions kind of by the seat of my pants. And he said it was really nerve-wracking. So remember what I said? The numbers don't make the decision. They just give context to what's going on. So I would really encourage farmers to either take a course or talk to their accountant or anybody to help them, first off, to learn how do we calculate them and what do they mean. Now, not everybody, but Tracy, I can't tell you how many farms over my career I've watched where they start off really not having very much comfort in this whole discussion to where they do it themselves. And they still go and ask somebody else for an opinion just because they want another opinion. But they know how to calculate them. They know what a debt servicing ratio is. They know what their working capital is. So they've learned over time. And then they still choose sometimes to go and talk to their accountant or whoever about, okay, these are my numbers. What do you think?
Yeah.
And third party look, third person look.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. I had to bring that up because sometimes, And even myself, same here. Like I said, I'll throw myself under the bus. I'm comfortable with certain parts of the financials. I've made myself learn. I'm not a numbers person by any means, but I know how important it is to business. But there's a lot of those ratios I haven't even calculated. So if people are sitting and watching and getting overwhelmed, it's step by step and ask questions. There's people there to help, right?
Yes, yeah. And you know what? Some of the help doesn't have to cost money, Tracy. I think maybe there is some sensitivity to that, and that's fair ball. But there are resources out there that don't require money. I would share information. I'll share ratios and give the people the tools, and if they want to work at them, put a spreadsheet together, and it's not that hard to do. Happy to do that. And there are other people like me that would help as well.
Love it. Love it. Okay, so why don't we, did you cover what you want to cover for ratios and guidelines? I want to jump into debt. And I know I've heard you say that debt often becomes a big focus point, action item when it comes to transition planning. So if you want to wrap up ratios, I'm not sure if you have anything left there, but that's where I want to go next and talk about debt and transition planning.
No, I don't have anything other to say about the actual debt. I appreciate that you asked, Tracy, because it's not an easy thing to talk about in a discussion that we're having, but it's an important thing to talk about. So if we've piqued somebody's interest here to maybe drill a little bit deeper into that, I think that's a good thing. So I'm thankful that you asked the question.
Good. And thank you. Okay. Well, then why don't we roll into that? I know, of course, and I mean, it makes sense. If something usually triggers people to take action and care about it. So if somebody hasn't been on top of their financials, it's definitely going to come to the forefront when the next generation wants to come in. Yes. And know what's going on and what's what, right? That makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, take it away.
Okay, well, and I'm going to start with this kind of generalization comment. So, and then specifically about transition, but every farm actually. What's important is to understand, or the farm family to understand, is what are we working towards?
Okay.
So they can call it their future, their goals, their vision, or whatever. So where does the family see themselves, say, 5 years from now? Okay, so that's number one. Number two, then, we measure financial performance because we need to look at the alignment between their financial capabilities and their vision. Can their financial performance on the farm get them to their vision? Is it strong enough? Or do we either have to make some adjustments to either one? Right? Once we get clarity on the future and we have the comfort that our financial performance is pretty good, then on a year-by-year basis, we manage towards it. So 3 key things that farms should keep in alignment. Okay, now let's talk about that from transition. The transition discussion in the future is to enable the transfer of ownership and management to the next generation. Finance plays a really important part in that, because oftentimes if the goal is to have some of the next generation continue on to farm, the legacy of the farm continues on, then the financial discussion has to include viability of the farm after the transition occurs. Okay, so why is that important? Well, because when mom and dad, I'm generalizing, when mom and dad retire, they're going to take some wealth out of that business. They're going to have to live on something. So that's money that's not available to the farm. So that has an impact on that farm's financial performance, or can have, typically does. But then there's another part. So oftentimes there are non-farming siblings, and mom and dad want in some way to, as part of their estate distribution, have their non-farming children end up with some money. Where does that money come from? Well, it's coming from the farm. And unless the farm, and I see the odd one like this, Tracy, but by golly, not a lot. But unless the farm has a lot of personal wealth outside the company, where they don't need to draw on the farm's financial resources to support the transition, then all that money is coming from the farm. So it starts to have more, it can start to have more impact. It makes the understanding of where the farm's at financially more important. Put it that way. Okay. Now, the management piece of it is, and there's 2 or 3 other aspects of this, why this becomes really important in my opinion. The management piece of this has to do with the next generation who might be 25, 30, 35 years old, who are coming into a farm today that will look significantly different than where their parents were when they were 25 or 30 years old. There's more capital, more debt right now, lower margins. And so this next generation is coming in, and the expectation is that they manage the business. So part of the management of that business in 2020 or 2025, whenever this is going to occur, is a whole different discussion around the importance of financial management compared to where their parents might have been 30 or 40 years ago. So there's a subtle but a very important aspect of financial management, in my opinion, when it comes to transition.
That's a good
Pardon?
Very good point. Because I look at my grandparents' farm and maybe other people's farms that I know of, and I didn't look at their books, but you can imagine credit wasn't easily accessible. I've heard them say that. So I know their farm operation compared to probably farms in this generation. If you took a 25-year-old and plopped them into both of those farms and expected them to run it and manage that, wow, one of those could be a disaster, because that's a lot of credit. And well, you're on the hook, right? And you got to have some financial savviness behind you.
Yeah. That's a great summary of what I understand why I understand that to be really important.
I would be scared.
Okay, so one other thing, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I would never let a 25-year-old child take the reins on the business that we have right now. That would be a mentorship, because that could be a disaster. And nothing against 25-year-old kids, but there's some big farm businesses, and go outside of farming, you usually have a controller to manage finances. And now go back to farming, we expect farmers to do the jobs that controllers have gone to school to do, right?
Right.
A little bit of a tangent, but.
Well, but no, it made me smile, because you've touched on one of the really, the kind of the sensitive aspects of transition, and that's management control. So, well, I mean, and sorry, not to extend this discussion too much, but Tracy, it could be, what's worse? So what's worse? Is it worse when we've got a mother and a father who are 65 years old with a farm worth $7 million, and the next generation's coming in, and the next generation wants to spend zero time at financial management, or where the next generation comes in and they want to control 100% of the financial management part? Both of those, I'd argue, are probably not preferred, but I will run into more farms, I believe, who have a hard time getting their children engaged in financial management, versus trying to keep them out of the financial management.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece that it's the point you raise. Yeah.
Okay, and maybe I'm coming from Tracy's shoes in my little world, but you deal with the farms all the time, so that's interesting to know. Okay, sorry, I opened a can of worms there. I'm good at that.
Well, yeah, you almost did. You almost did. I got another really important aspect of this.
Excellent.
Of this discussion around debt and financial management and transition. And that, I think, has to do with understanding what debt is.
Okay.
And what I see sometimes become really challenging is where the daughter, the farming daughter or the farming son, marry or have a non-farming partner, someone from the city. And oftentimes that partner won't really have an appreciation for the magnitude of debt and investment in a farm. They literally will not have had that orientation. And so I think in a lot of cases, any debt is too much debt because they don't understand debt. And if they don't understand debt, it's going to make them nervous. And so I think there's a really important part of financial management, especially around debt in transition, and that has to do with having everybody understand what debt is and why we use it and how we use it. To me, you asked a question at the start, and I didn't really say it. What is debt bad? To me, it's not about is debt bad. To me, the questions is how much and how do we manage it? That's how much and how do we manage it? And so for people who come into a farm by way of marriage or just a connection, a relationship where they don't have that background, I think we need to. I think the farm family should spend some time, as best they can, having those people understand what debt is.
Okay, that's fair. I could see that being a big issue in farm families and in-laws, the in-law factor, right?
Yep.
Okay. I didn't want to cut you off there. I have two more things I want to cover, and anywhere else you want to go with this conversation, I'll try to stop opening those can of worms, Terry. I'm so good at that. Two that I want to chat about are interest rates, and then dive into some tips and techniques to help farmers manage debt. How does that sound?
Sounds really good. Yep. I get asked a lot about interest rates and et cetera. So I'm happy to talk about them.
Okay, then let's do it because that's such an important one.
Well, the typical questions I get are about should we lock in interest rates or should we let them float? And yeah, that would be the most common question I get, and I get it frequently. And it's like selling grain. If you sell some canola now, like if you sold some canola at $10.50 and now it's $12, well, then you're like, rats, why did I sell it for $10.50? Because now it's obviously $12. So, and the converse works for interest rates. If you lock interest rates in at 4.5, and now they're at 2.5 or 2.25, or whatever you could borrow it at, that may seem rats. We've foregone that opportunity. The analogy, Tracy, to me is if you sell canola at $10, did you make or $10.50? Did you make a margin of profit at that? Yeah. And would you make more at 12? Certainly. But if you made a margin of profit at $10.50, then okay, that's what we chose to do. At interest rates, if a farmer's locked them in at 4.25, and now they've fallen below that, 4.25 is not a bad interest rate, historically speaking. And can they do anything about it? Perhaps. In canola, you can maybe take a position in the marketplace to try to extract more value out of that. So there are some remedies potentially available to people. When it comes to interest rates, there's different things that they can do. So when someone asks me, should they lock in their interest rates or let them float? You know what my answer is? It depends.
I was going to say it depends.
It depends.
It yeah. So true.
Yeah. So
true.
But it is so true. And what does it depend upon? Well, it depends upon the situation the farm's in. And that situation is defined by the balance sheet. This becomes quite this discussion would require more time than we have in this interview right here, Tracy. But a farm with a lot of debt is more susceptible to an interest rate increase than a farm that doesn't have much debt. So one of the questions is, when farmers are deciding is should they lock rates in or should they let them float, is can they afford for rates to go up? And so if they take their amount of debt and then add, at what point do interest rates get to where the increase in the interest associated with the interest rate increase on their farm starts to cause them cash flow problems?
Yeah.
And where the cash flow problems associated with increasing interest rates become a problem is where the farm increasingly has to allocate more of their operating money to paying interest when they might be better to put it into fertilizer and feed. And it can get to be that severe at some point. So to me, one of the first discussions, or one of the first things farmers should think about when they're looking at locking in interest rates or letting them float, is what can we afford to take on? How much risk can we afford to take on that rates might go up? Now, the other thing that becomes really important here, we've talked about it a couple of times here, is where the farm is at in its life cycle. So I had this discussion just the other day. And you get a young farm, let's say that we're borrowing $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
We can lock it in at 4.25%. And there are some really good lenders out there, some really nice programs that would be not a bad decision. So 4.25% interest on $1 million is $42,500 a year. The young farmer could float that interest rate at 2.25%, perhaps, depending on a whole bunch of other factors. At 2.25% on that $1 million, that's $22,500. So there's $20,000 available to that young farmer if they allowed the interest rates to float versus lock them in. But here's the but. Likely that young farmer or younger farmer doesn't have the financial stability, perhaps, of a more mature farmer, and it might be riskier, might be much more highly risky for them to float than to lock in. Because you can go to lenders now in Manitoba and lock in 4.25% interest rates for 20 or 25 years. And you'd have to go to the websites and get the current rate, but I was on there not that long ago. 20 years, guaranteed money at 4.25%.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of farmers I talk to think, that's not so bad. But then to the point, a young farmer could sure use that $20,000, right?
Yes.
So one of the other things here that we're going to get into the tips here. So I'm going to broach the two if I can just for a minute here. If I'm a young farmer, I might be tempted to take the $20,000 because I could sure use it. But here's my tip. If they're taking that $20,000 and buying a new Skidoo, that's not a good decision. I mean, it's 100% good decision by them. I'm not being critical of that decision, but it's not a really good business decision. You know what I mean? If they're going to take that $20,000 and rent more land or buy more implements or do something that's going to get their business more towards its vision, remember that I was talking about, mm-hmm. then maybe they should take the risk and let them float.
Okay.
So the decision becomes highly dependent upon those ratios that I talked about, the debt servicing, the liquidity ratio, and those are different for a 60-year-old farmer typically than a 30-year-old farmer.
Terry, can I say something?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah.
Really quick. Prime example, when we were looking at doing our lending, we are fairly young in our farming life cycle. And I looked at it and I talked to Anthony, and this was before I had the show and access to all these great minds. And I said to Anthony, why don't we lock it in? I'm not risk adverse, but there's so much in farming that is risky that you can't control. Calf prices go up and down all the time. I said, yeah, sure, it could drop lower and we could be overpaying on interest. But I said, I would sure love to lock in our interest rates so that we know the upside more than anything else. And the number one reason that we did that decision at that point might be different 10 years down the line. We did that decision because we had a lot of short-term debt, cattle loans that have to be paid, big dollars paid over 6 years. Well, your margins start to get smaller.
Yeah.
If we were 20 years down the line, let our interest rate float because we have a lot more room to play in our financials. And that's why I made that decision. Yes, you could be overpaying interest, but at least I know the upside of where my interest is, and that's not something that's going to blindside me. That was my reasoning, Anthony's reasoning when we did that.
Well, and there'd be a lot of people who would say to you, Tracy, that's sound reasoning.
Okay, I thought it was crazy.
No, I think it's sound reasoning, and the tip correlation to that is what the decision that you make it an informed decision. Not just a gut decision, not just I hope. So that's good.
Okay.
The other comment I want to talk about on interest rates has to do with how do we know when to lock them in or to let them float. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of I've heard other experts or knowledgeable people talking about what to look for. So I'm going to give you, or not give you, but I'm going to talk about 3 things that farmers can watch for that would maybe give them some insight or information into when to lock in the rates.
Perfect.
So one is the spread between short-term rates and long-term rates.
Okay.
So longer-term rates, a bank charges 4.25% for a long-term 10-year mortgage, and 2.5% maybe for operating money, short term. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that their rates are higher long term is because they are long term. And then the bank or the lender is managing their risk. They're more confident in the certainty of what they know about interest rates in the short term. Therefore, they can be more aggressive and lend at a lower margin. Longer term rates, they need to be a little bit more stable. And so that's why that spread. So a longer term rate will pretty much always have a higher interest rate than a short term rate. A fixed rate, higher rate than a floating rate. Okay. So those rates move, but they don't always move at the same time. So you might not get a scenario where long-term rates went from 4.25% to 5.25%, and short-term rates went from 2.5% to 3.5%. They may not move in lockstep, because if you think of it from a lender's perspective, remember, short-term, they have more confidence in knowing what's going on. They might start to get a little bit nervous about the bank's risk, because the banks borrow money to lend money. So they might get a little bit concerned about the longer term commitments they're making here. So a bank might move, or a lender might move the long-term rate up to 5.25%, but leave the short-term rate at 2.5% or 2.25%. So number one, watch the trends or the spread between short-term rates and long-term rates, and what are they doing? So that's number one. Number two is track inflation rate. So if the inflation rate, and this just now historically for the last number of years, if the Bank of Canada or the Fed, they call it in the States, excuse me, can keep inflation at or preferably below 2%, then they're comfortable in leaving the interest rates low. If inflation starts to creep up, then the worry is that people are going to want to borrow more money. And so we've learned by years ago that double-digit inflation was awful for the economy. Okay, so what's the Bank of Canada do? If they think inflation is starting to heat up, then they'll increase the interest rates, because interest rates then are a negative to businesses borrowing or the consumer borrowing money. So inflation goes up, interest rates then go up to curb the inflation. So number 2 is watch what the inflation rate is.
Okay.
And as long as it's 2 or that's what the history is, but anyway, 2 or lower, not a lot of need by the Bank of Canada to raise their rate. So the Bank of Canada sets a rate. The lenders in Canada borrow against that and lend against the farmer at a margin. So the Bank of Canada rate is set, and part of how the Bank of Canada governors set their rate is to do with inflation. So number 2 is watch the inflation.
That's a great explanation. Thank you.
The third one is the employment rate. So too high an employment rate is not good, and too low is okay. But I have a hard time, Tracy, because I grew up with it called the unemployment rate. But now,
I was going to ask you the unemployment rate, Terry. Yeah. I'm like, the employment rate, what?
Well, because a long time ago, we as a society determined that, no, we're not going to call it unemployment rate. We're going to call it the employment rate. It's just the opposite. So can I talk about it as the unemployment rate?
Yes, please, and we'll know what you're talking about.
If the number of unemployed people in Canada starts to increase, they want to stimulate the economy to get them back to work.
Okay.
And one way that the Bank of Canada stimulates the economy is lower the interest rates.
Right.
Lower the interest rates, then businesses borrow more money, hire more people, bang, problem solved.
Okay.
But it's not a static situation. So if the unemployment rate goes wait a minute now, if the unemployment rate starts going up, then they want to stimulate the economy, downward pressure on interest rates.
Okay.
If the unemployment rate is really low, then typically that would have to do with the economy being really robust. Likely the inflation is going to start to bump up a little bit because people are working, and when people work, they have money, and when interest rates are low, they spend money, which becomes a whole reinforcing loop. So if the unemployment rate is high, the government or the Bank of Canada is really reluctant to increase interest rates too much, because interest rates are a real negative when it comes to employment. So I would watch those 3 things, and I don't know, how often would you check them? Well, I don't know, man. I don't know. Every couple of months, maybe. I whatever the family wants. But there's 3 things. 3 sources, and none of those 3 things are going to tell the family that, okay, now you lock in, but it give the family some information that they could use to decide whether they should lock in or not, perhaps.
Okay, that was a great explanation. You can tell you teach this stuff, Terry.
Yeah. Well, I teach it, and we talk about it, because for farmers it's really important. You know, how do we do it, and do we lock in, and don't we lock in, and you know? So then the other thing is that we'll talk about it maybe in another interview someday. But I'd like to get into a discussion about, well, what does a farmer do if they've got a bunch of money locked in at, I see some farms with money locked in at 5 or 5.5. Can they renegotiate that loan to a 2% or 2.5% rate? So that becomes a whole other discussion. There are some things that farmers can do if they're not really all that happy about how their existing loans are structured.
I am sensing, as we were sitting here talking about this, I'm sensing a whole nother episode on interest rates. So stay tuned, audience.
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff.
Yeah. Low interest rates probably benefit transition. It's maybe a good time for farmers to take advantage of that. I can't think of too much more.
Okay, excellent. So to wrap up the episode, we'll do the action items. Tips to manage debt.
Tips to manage debt. Well, align the repayment of the debt with the farm's earned ability to do it, and try to keep those things as appropriately aligned as you can, and then factor in the margin that the family's comfortable with for error. Remember, the debt servicing 1-to-1 theoretically works, but 1.5-to-1 is just more comfortable. So number one would, well, I don't know number one, but one of the things that comes to mind is just align the earning ability of the farm with the commitments that the farm has to the debt that they have. So that would be one. Okay. Another tip is, I say this, Tracy, by observation, but another tip is, whatever the farm family is able to do to gain a better understanding, increase their knowledge, incrementally, step by step, about ratios associated with debt, is a good thing. Because knowledge is power, information is power, and a family that has a better understanding of what debt servicing means or working capital means is just helps them in managing their business. And I can't say to anybody listening here that if a farmer, took a course and learned how to calculate these ratios, that they'd make more money. I can't say that. I can't quantify that. But what I can say, just anecdotally, is I've watched farms do it and benefit from it incredibly, because reduces stress, helps relationships, gives them a foundation to make some of these decisions. The one really thing I would have forgot to talk about this till right now, but from the transition perspective, if the parents at 50 or 45 or whatever, 60 years old, embrace a proactive approach to dealing with financial management, that's what the next generation grows up observing. And they'll just acquire those family best practices when it comes to how we do business around here. How we do business around here means that we spend time actively understanding the financial performance of our business, including correlations between profit and debt. And that's just, those are the lessons learned or lessons passed on to their children.
That's a great point, Terry. Because if you're not taught that growing up, it's that much harder to know what you don't know and seek out that information, right?
Exactly.
If it comes to you as part of your upbringing and your mentorship, so to speak, on the farm, well, then that's just status quo and you're that much further ahead.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Another one, I only have 2 or 3 more that come to mind here. And now I got a bit of a mind break here for a minute. We were talking about interest rates or information, pardon me, in the next generation. Oh no, I know. Okay. So I run in too many times to farm families, and oftentimes it's the next generation that's come in where they don't have a good foundation of information to work from.
Okay.
So if we're talking to farmers about analyzing ratios and we're not creating that base set of information that they need to calculate the ratios, then it's going to be really frustrating and in worse. So this is how I talk to people about this. A farmer would be better. This is going to contradict everything I've said today, but a farmer would be better to make decisions or continue to make decisions without any information than if they're making decisions based on bad information.
Okay.
Yeah. So we need to create that, and I run across too many situations where I don't think that foundation of financial information in the statements is presented in a way that the family could easily use it. So that's another. And I can remember I had a young woman on a call this summer, and this is a Saskatchewan farmer, and she said through the discussion, she said, we're talking about capturing information and how to organize it. And she said, why did nobody ever talk to me about this? Why does my accountant not talk to me about this? Well, it was a rhetorical question. I don't know. But to my point, Tracy, that I think there's too many people out there that are using information that is maybe not organized quite as good as it could be, and then that makes what I'm suggesting they do more difficult and more frustrating, and maybe a reason why they don't do it.
Yeah. Okay. Good point.
Yep. One more here, and two more. I said this before, but I want to state it again because it's really important. And the family needs to be really clear on the purpose of the debt. What's the debt for?
Okay.
How's it going to help us? And how are we going to manage the risk associated with it? So I've already said that, but I just wanted to reinforce that. And the last thing is, okay, let's say that the farmer is able to, or maybe his 4.25% interest rate loan matures, and then he decides to float it at 2.25%. And let's go back to it. Let's say it's a $1 million loan. So he was paying $42,500 a year on interest, 4.25% of $1 million. Now he's going to pay $22,500. My last tip is, don't just spend the $20,000. The farm will eat up all that money. Mm-hmm. Keep paying it theoretically at the 4.25% rate and save $20,000.
Nice.
Build up that balloon of capital in cash in some deposit that when an opportunity comes along that you can jump on it.
I love that, Terry. I love that.
Make the money, let the money work for you.
Yeah.
And too many farmers think that money going to debt is working against them. No, flip the discussion. Make the debt work for you.
Nice.
That's my tips. Not very many, but.
Love it. Well, and you know what? That was a good summary, because really, essentially through the whole interview, you've been giving tips to optimize and use debt. So that was a great way to summarize it. And I know I was going to touch on the role of reaching out and having professional advisors, and we can touch on that a little bit. We did throughout the interview.
Yeah, we did. We're okay.
Yeah. And really, at the end of the day, I know you would encourage, and I would encourage farmers. I had the same journey. You look at all this stuff, and the reason I learned was not with my farming hat on. I was working for a company that had investors, and we had bookkeepers that created financials. And you know what? I had to learn pretty darn quick how to read those financials and present that information to them. Because you know why? If I didn't, I wouldn't have been the CEO that they needed for that company. And guess where I would have been? Gone, right? They would have hired somebody that could effectively lead that company.
Can I make two more comments? You have just made that's an awesome comment. And I have never thought about this before. But you had to learn those statements so you could talk about them. Why doesn't a farm family then take somebody in the family, get that person to learn or calculate these ratios, and then present them to the other people in the family? That's not a threatening environment. That's a comfortable environment. So they learn off of each other. That's a really interesting idea. If they feel, well, I'm going to go talk to Terry and then I'm going to feel like I'm the dumbest person ever. No, take that out of there. Just do it themselves. That's a really interesting point. And it made me think of a farm family that asked me to come out and talk to their kids. So I went to Saskatchewan and took their financial statements and calculated some of these key ratios. And I talked to two of their children that were now getting involved in the farm. They're 20 years old, 22 years old. And went through the ratios, went through the financial statements. Parents were there. And parents they could have done it. They wanted their children to hear from somebody other than them. And the one comment I remember from that was, well, we learned all this in school, but this is a way better because you explain it using our own statements, not the school information. So that's another idea.
I like that, Terry. And kind of where I was going to is I learned this because I had to. I didn't have a choice. Where sometimes I think farmers, nobody's holding our feet to the fire to keep a job, so to speak. We're self-employed. We're not going to fire ourselves. I had to learn this. I learned this in university, and oh boy, I could maybe ruffle some feathers, but seeing it in a book format to pass your grades is one thing. Taking it and sitting down and bit by bit, I taught myself, and I'm not going like this. If I can do it, anybody can do it. Looking at those financials and making it real. And just one step, you're one step better than you were last month or last year, right? And then sure enough, you're savvy at this stuff. That's how I learned. And again, I'm not special. Anybody can do this stuff.
But yeah, you're exactly right. It's the step by step. It's the proverb of when do you plant an oak tree? Well, 100 years ago or today. You got to start someplace. It's a journey. It is just, you said it, step by step. And yeah, it can work. Well, good on you.
No, that's not good on me. The only reason I say that is because if we don't make it a priority and we don't sit down and do that uncomfortable part and make those mistakes and go, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
We don't ever do it, right? So thank you for the compliment, but that was my goal in saying that is we got to be the best CEOs of our farm businesses in my mind, right? So that we are managing our farm business operation and farm production operation top notch. That's my goal.
That's a good goal.
Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. I'm a little passionate about this stuff.
all good, Tracy, all good. Yeah.
Terry, I loved our time together on this episode. I do believe we had a big mountain of information we wanted to cover. Did you share everything you wanted to share with our audience for the time given?
Oh, tongue in cheek, I'm going to say no. I mean, there's lots more we could talk about, but no, seriously. Yeah, I thought we had a lot to talk about, and I hope that people that are listening picked up the odd pointer on this discussion. It is a really important discussion, Tracy, and it seems to be that debt and farming go hand in hand, and happy to talk about it with you.
Love it. Thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom with our audience. I appreciate it. Our audience appreciate it. So thank you, Terry. And thank you guys in the audience for joining us on this episode. If you liked it as much as I know you did, like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, and get the word out so other farmers can hear the mountain of wisdom that our guests like Terry have to share. Thank you guys for joining us, and see you on the next episode. Bye, guys.
Bye.
You've been listening to Impact Farming. For more great episodes and articles designed to help you manage and grow your farming operation, head on over to farmmarketer.com. Don't forget to sign up while you're there. We will see you on the next episode.